A little while ago, we talked about prisons and the systems behind them and some of the big ideas behind them. But I really felt like we only scratched the surface when it comes to the conditions of a prison in its form and space and order that can not only contain people physically, but control you psychologically. So I wanted to look at 5 different sci-fi movies that discuss this idea of control through architecture, that use specific architectural strategies to control you in the most powerful way possible by creating a prison in your mind. A portion of this video is sponsored by MSI. The first movie is a cult classic. It's called Cube. It's actually a Canadian movie from the 90s where a group of strangers wake up inside a cube. This cube has doors that lead to 6 other cubes, and it's this giant, intricate network of thousands of cubes, and some of them can kill you in the most horrendous way possible. So the story is about these strangers trying to figure out a way out. And it's an example of a story where the architecture itself is a narrative device. So first thing this reminded me of was Jean Nouvel's Institut du Monde Arabe, which is a cultural center in Paris for promoting Arab culture. There's so many visual similarities, like this panelized grid system. You can see how between each of the panels, there's this structural bracing. And in the cube, this is actually used to climb the cube in 3 dimensions. The panels themselves are actually quite similar. So the most notable feature of this building is actually the facade. On the south facade is Mashrabias, which is, if you watch my video on Dune, you would know that there's screens or lattice work from Islamic architecture that's used to regulate light and heat. And the panels themselves are made up of these beautiful, intricate apertures that were inspired by traditional Arab geometries, and they open and close to regulate sunlight. The system is very delicate, kind of like clockwork, which is kind of an interesting connection because the cube itself also moves and functions like a clock. You kind of have to move within a certain amount of time before the cube moves again. Is it a reach? Maybe. In the cube, we have these plexiglass panels, which is not for regulating natural light, but it had another very interesting function. So the budget for this movie was $350,000 Canadian dollars, which is equivalent to roughly $2.8 million with inflation. So they could only build 1 room for their set, and they changed the colors to make it seem like multiple cubes. The cube was built in 1997, and Mont Arabe was built in 1987. Could it have been inspired? Maybe. These handles are actually die rods, which are those things that you can thread metal rods with and turn them into screws. They also reminded me of gizmos by Olsen Kundig, which are these mechanical devices that they include in most of their projects. For example, here we have a hand-cranked contraption, which works on a counterbalance principle. Essentially, it allows you to pivot this 6-ton steel and glass window with a minimal amount of force. These gizmos, they give movement to static objects, and it entices the users to become active participants in the movement of the building. What's also interesting about the cube is that it's architecture that's designed to be accessed in 3 dimensions. I actually can't think of any built examples of this for obvious safety and accessibility reasons, but I think it would be really cool. The other really cool thing is it's a kinetic structure. There's lots of built examples of kinetic facades that we use to regulate sunlight, but there's not a lot of examples of kinetic buildings where the spaces themselves are moving. There was this proposal for this rotating tower in, big surprise, Dubai. And essentially, it's a skyscraper that can change shape, and it can give different views throughout the day by rotating the floors around a central core. Each of the floors would move independently, and it would cantilever off the core. So there's major challenges structurally and major challenges with the mechanical system, because it means you need the plumbing and the mechanical system to connect and reconnect to the shaft every time it rotates. So, kind of an engineering nightmare. So it was canceled. There is actually a build project, but it's at a much smaller scale, and it has these rotating rooms that can create different programs for the house. But definitely nothing like the three-dimensional movement from the cube. I designed the outer shell.
What?
This guy is so pathetic.
You built this thing?
Not this part, the exterior. I don't know anything about the numbers or anything else in here.
So I think the big question is it really possible that an architect can work on a project and not have a clue of what they're working on? Yeah, it's actually plausible. Because our profession has become very, very specialized. In fact, the more specialized you become, the more money you can make. And actually, that's true for a lot of professionals.
Who hired you?
I didn't even ask. I didn't even leave my office. Architecture, unfortunately, is full of people like this. Really smart, but totally jaded people. Because they go into the profession with huge egos, thinking they're going to change the world, and they get beaten down by reality. So, yes, sad but true. That's my biggest fear.
This is the room we started in. We should never have moved in the first place.
Major spoilers. But the whole system is basically designed to kind of suggest that you need to do something to escape. But in the end, they find out that by staying in the same spot, the cube rearranges itself and they could have gotten out without getting killed. So philosophically, I think it's actually really powerful, because if you put a human in a room, like in an empty room, they are going to do something with it. And they're going to try to make sense of it. Just like how these characters think that the architect was this evil villain and there was this whole conspiracy around it. And I think it speaks to this human tendency to always try to act on something and try to figure it out and make sense of things. Because sometimes inaction is harder than action. Overall, I think the cube presents some really interesting ideas, because it has this underlying mathematical logic, but we can't comprehend the purpose. And there's this tension between reason and randomness. And it reminds me of a quote from Umberto Eco. "I have come to believe that the whole world is an enigma, a harmless enigma that's made terrible by our own mad attempt to interpret it as though it had an underlying truth." He was always critical about our systems of categorizing knowledge, and he was saying that we often treat our scientific knowledge, or the things that we know, as the ultimate truth. And he saw flaws in that. So I think the most interesting part about this movie is the logic. Because if they had just stood there for a certain amount of time, they could have gotten out. Now let's move on to the platform. It's similar in that the architecture itself is the story and the narrative device. So the whole movie starts in this elegant, high-end kitchen where everything is meticulously checked and examined to perfection. And for a full minute, there's no dialogue. It just immerses you into the colors and the sound of the culinary experience, which you'll find out is the setting for a very messed up story. This is the official start. I think it's actually a reference to the cube. So he wakes up in this concrete box and he finds another man, and that's his cellmate. The entire movie takes place inside this concrete box, which is just one floor in hundreds of floors in a massive concrete tower. And every day, the kitchen upstairs prepares this beautiful feast, and they place it on this platform, which moves down this opening, and it stops on each floor for the people to eat the food, and it keeps going down until it reaches the very bottom. The problem is, the upper levels usually eat everything, and as you go further down, they have less and less food, which leads to some pretty messed up stuff. What's more interesting is that at the end of every month, the inmates are randomly assigned to a different level, and depending on which level they're on, it completely transforms the dynamic between the inmates. So, like I said, the entire movie takes place in these rectangular concrete rooms, which seems pretty simple, but if you think about it, why not a white room? Why a rectangle and not a square or a circle? So there's actually a lot of thinking that goes behind this. First, concrete. Especially repeated like this, it means it's cheap and efficient and indestructible. And it also has this lifeless and brutalist quality, right? And why a rectangle and not a square? The story revolves around this dynamic between two characters, the two inmates in a cell. So the rectangle creates this tension between the two sides. If it was a square, you wouldn't actually have this because all the sides would be equal, right? The space can have a huge impact on the relationship between the people in it. There's a great story from Ed Catmull, the co-founder of Pixar. They had this rectangular table that they've been using for 13 years. And whenever they'd have meetings, people would face each other and with any overflow seated along the walls. And the directors and the producers, or the people at the top of the hierarchy, would naturally sit at the center of the table. So the heart of the conversations happened here, and the further you were, the less likely you were to speak up. One of the days they couldn't use this room, so they had a meeting in a smaller room with a square table. And what they found is that they had much better conversations because everyone was facing each other and there was eye contact, and it made it easy for everyone to participate. So our spaces have a huge impact on how we behave. And I think the production design team for this movie really put a lot of thought into how the architecture was designed. You guys might have noticed, we usually model and render most of these structures ourselves. And for this video, we use the Creator 16 AI Studio laptop from MSI. Typically, we use multiple apps, AI and GPU renderers to create and visualize our assets. And all of this was incredibly smooth thanks to the RTX 4090, plenty of RAM, and a 16-core Intel Ultra 9 series CPU. The Creator 16 AI Studio also has an NPU that can do independent calculations for those AI-related software, optimizing performance in the background and accelerating the process. And this is a super cool feature, MSI AI Artist, so you can generate AI images locally without any waiting time, even if you're off the grid. Sometimes when we approach a video, our imagination can run a little bit wild. But this laptop packs the performance of a workstation, including a high-res 4K mini LED monitor, and so far, it was able to deliver in every step of the process. If you want to learn more, check out the link in the description. So anyways, because of these budgetary constraints, they only built 3 of these concrete boxes, and then they just extended the tower in CGI. And I think it really shows you that by creating a logic or a set of rules, you really don't need to spend a lot of money on doing crazy visual effects. Technically, yes, it's just a concrete box, but once you build this logic and how this world works in the plot, you can kind of make people believe anything. In this case, it's a concrete box, but it's a concrete box within a tower of hundreds of levels where, based on which level you're on, you could live or die. I think Inception is actually a really good example. This picture represents a rainy city, and this picture also represents a rainy city. But from the logic of Inception, we know that this is not just a city, but it's a dream inside a dream, where gravity and time behaves completely differently. I think this hole is actually the main antagonist. Obviously, it has a functional purpose, but the psychological impact of this endless pit is huge. Something that's endless and repetitive and infinite, it can become incredibly overwhelming. This is Peter Eisenman's memorial to the murdered Jews in Berlin. He put 2,700 concrete stelae arranged in a grid, and each stelae is unique in height and tilt, and it's supposed to reflect the unique identities of the victims from the Holocaust. But at the same time, this vastness and coldness, it really mirrors the industrial scale of the Holocaust. And when you walk around the grid, you feel overwhelmed, and it feels claustrophobic, and you feel disoriented and also isolated. And I think it really forces you to reflect on the magnitude of what happened. Here, the scale of this also makes you feel insignificant And this actually has another effect on the characters. They lose their humanity really fast. It's interesting to see how quickly the people become straight up evil in this environment. Because yes, they're trying to survive, but I think when you're in this vast, incomprehensible vacuum where your actions or your character means nothing, and there's no world, and there's no time, and there's no you, something interesting happens. This is a really interesting dialogue. This guy ties him up, and he's getting ready to eat his flesh for sustenance. And this guy's basically saying, you are going to be responsible for my death. And then he responds saying, no, I'm not responsible. The people who are responsible are the people above and the people who created this platform. And then he's saying, I want you to know that I hold you responsible, not the people above, not the people who created this platform, just you. And I just thought this was a really interesting conversation, because a sense of responsibility to yourself and to other people is the one thing that keeps us civilized. But responsibility is a social construct, and in an environment of scarcity and extreme hierarchy and anonymity and isolation, where you feel like nothing you do actually matters, this sense of responsibility, it can disappear very quickly. Now let's move on to Minority Report. For the minority of you who haven't watched it, the background of the story is set in the year 2054, where they've come up with a way to predict crime before it happens, and they call this pre-crime. And they use psychics called precogs. And it's a very intricate system. And Tom Cruise is the chief of the prime crime unit, who's a hardcore believer in the system due to some personal tragedies. But the story really unravels when he discovers a flaw in the system. This concept of predicting crime with human brains is actually not new. And for the nerds of you out there, it was seen in a Japanese cyberpunk anime called Psychopaths. So this here is the prison, and it actually looks really similar to the Panopticon layout, but it functions very differently. The inmates are kept in these tubes that keep them in a lucid dream state, so the prison is essentially a super efficient storage space for their bodies. You can see how the tubes come out of the ground, and each tube has multiple bodies. So I can imagine the basement of this being kind of a refrigerant with a conveyor belt system, kind of like an automated parking lot, which feels extremely inhumane, but it kind of really depends on what's going on inside their heads. Look at them. Look at how peaceful they all seem. But on the inside, busy, busy, busy. I love this guy. This is one of the most friggin' interesting ideas from Sci-Fi. It's this idea of separating the body from the mind. And the body becomes a sleeve, or that's the term they use from Altered Carbon. And this could really lead to unlimited possibilities in how you could store a body, but still travel in space and in time. I don't know if you guys watched the latest season of Black Mirror, but they use this idea to travel to outer space, right? And it kind of led to some really messed up things. You can even break the bounds of time by freezing your body, like maybe if you have an irreparable injury, and you just exist in your mind until they invent the technology to cure you. Just like in Vanilla Sky, which also led to some really messed up things. We talked about this in our prison architecture video, but there's two approaches to imprisonment: rehabilitation and punishment. Rehab statistically has a much lower recidivism rate, but most countries can't afford to spend $120,000 a prisoner, like places like Norway. So in a world where keeping prisoners or storing active bodies are too expensive, by dividing the mind and the body and keeping just the mind active, it could actually give them the help that they need. I don't know if it's that unrealistic to say one day to create a downloadable copy of the data in your brain. And obviously we can't copy our souls, but maybe we're not that far away from this future. I know it sounds super dystopian and super unethical, but if you compare it to some of the physical conditions of some of these prisons, maybe the alternative is not so bad. The condition of the prisons are, unfortunately, hugely determined by money. So I think it's impossible to talk about prisons without the idea of efficiency. Narkina 5, the Imperial Security Detention Facility. My favorite prison. That was weird. It's from the show ANDOR, and it's located on a planet that's covered with water. And this is what you see as you approach the prison, this vast ocean. So it's a natural deterrent to escape. And actually, you see this in different moments of the prison, like these windows. They're not necessary, but it gives the prisoners a sense of how massive and almost infinite this facility is, and how small they are in comparison. In my other video, I talked about the system behind this facility and how it's really the high-tech and kind of the most ideal version of the panopticon, because the control mechanism and the surveillance mechanism is directly integrated into the architecture, and it allows the facility of thousands of inmates to be monitored by just a few guards. But today, I wanted to talk about something different, and I think it's actually the most brilliant part about this prison, which is this extreme efficiency and the extreme optimization of resources.
Good morning, inmates. Your day will start with a quick breakfast. All of your essential utensils are embedded in the amenities panel. Don't forget to hydrate yourself before starting the day. To avoid sudden and painful death, don't leave your cell before the tungstoid floor panels are deactivated. You have 3 minutes to head over to the sanitation room, where your body and your clothes will be sterilized at the same time. In an orderly fashion, please transfer to the work area and follow the orders of your team leader. And remember, based on your productivity, you will have a chance to enjoy flavor at the end of your shift. On this facility, cells interlock like bunk beds, and the corners are rounded to prevent dust buildup and make cleaning more efficient. Lights and other features are integrated into the walls, so they can't be used as weapons. There's no doors or barriers in the cells, since any unauthorized egress results in immediate death. Time for bed and get ready for the next shift. And cheer up! Look at the counter tab to see the number of cycles left in your stay.
Some of these spaces might remind you of the extreme efficiency you see on an airplane cabin, and these modular hospital patient rooms by NXT Health, which feature a very similar design with multiple components seamlessly embedded together. They're prefabricated so they can mass-produce high-quality modules quickly and efficiently, with all of the necessary technology integrated into the architecture. Except in Narkina 5, it's the inmates that are assembling the modules for more prisons, creating this endless, twisted manufacturing cycle, using the inmates as free labor, over and over and over again.
Are you now?
THX 1138 is by George Lucas, and it's actually one of his very first movies before he was the George Lucas. And it's based on an underground society where the state controls people through mandatory drug use, which suppresses their emotions. People are basically just numbers. THX 1138 is the name of the main character, played by the very young Robert Duvall. And you might have guessed from her expression, the problem starts when she stops taking her drugs and starts feeling emotions. This is a factory where they make all the droids. And you might be asking, why don't they make droids do it? And the answer to that, I'm gonna pass it off to Cassian Andor.
We're cheaper than droids and easier to replace.
Apparently, replicating the human body is actually a lot harder than trying to replicate human cognition. Although they seem to be making some pretty big headway into this as well. To be clear, this is not a prison. In fact, Just by looking at this, it kind of looks the opposite, right? They have these endless open white spaces. There's no walls, no visible boundaries, and they go to work and they can leave, and they are free to move around the way they want. So why am I even bringing this up? A lot of you mentioned Foucault in my last video, who talked about the panopticon, but more as a metaphor for modern society that controls people, not by force, but through surveillance. And I think the society in this movie is kind of a very sadistic version of this idea. Here's a scene where he's confessing. This is an image of Christ, so they are religious. But it's very obvious that this thing is not actually capable of listening or responding, but THX keeps talking to him. And I think, in a way, it's speaking to the society that hasn't really been forced into compliance, but it's transitioned almost voluntarily and at the pretense of being for their own good.
If you feel you are not properly sedated, call 348-844 immediately. Failure
So when
to
people feel like there's something wrong with them, they actually self-report as not being properly sedated. Foucault talks about this exact idea, a society that gains power under the guise of efficiency and safety and the common good. And I think it's especially interesting now because in the last couple of years, with COVID especially, some countries have gladly handed over data to the government. He wrote Discipline and Punish in 1975, before social media and big data, before 9/11 and before COVID, where obviously we've seen a pretty big increase in surveillance, and a lot of times in the guise of the common good. So I do wonder what he would think now. This is the Marin County Civic Center by Frank Lloyd Wright, and actually this is one of his final projects, and it was completed after his death in 1959. And the fact that they used this building actually is really ironic. So before Frank Lloyd Wright, civic buildings typically had a very clear separation between the government spaces and the public spaces. Public access was usually limited to specific areas because it was all about conveying solidarity and permanence and the hierarchies and the political structures. But Frank Lloyd Wright was like, no, a civic center should be a palace for the people. So he blended government functions with public functions and included things like a library and an auditorium and an exhibition hall. So it's really a symbol of a new type of a civic space that's about governments, but also about public engagement. It also followed his principle of organic architecture that exists in perfect harmony between human and the natural world. So he added curves, and it's integrated with the landscape, and he added these big open skylights. So it is really ironic that this symbol of democratic values was used as a visual backdrop for this kind of totalitarian regime. I was actually wondering if he was trying to critique the whiteness of modernism and minimalism. In this movie, you see so many good examples of what you would call non-places, or spaces that don't have enough significance to be regarded as places. It's a place that's devoid of any identity or history or human connection or emotional attachment. Because colors or artwork or architectural details, they kind of create this sense of connection with a place. And a connection to a place also kind of helps you define your sense of place in the world. So these non-places, they essentially strip you of your sense of self. And these endless open spaces, in a way, they force us to confront the emptiness and monotony of our existence. That got kind of dark. But these were the prisons that I thought were pretty interesting. So what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments if there's any other interesting prisons that I should cover.